Chapter 1 of Lord Beaupre. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nicholas Clifford, Middlebury, Vermont, USA. Lord Beaupre by Henry James. Chapter 1. Some reference had been made to Northerly, which was within an easy drive, and Firminger described how he had dined there the night before, and had found a lot of people. Mrs. Ashbury, one of the two visitors, inquired who these people might be, and he mentioned half a dozen names, among which was that of young Raddle, which had been a good deal on people's lips, and even in the newspapers, on the occasion, still recent, of his stepping into the fortune, exceptionally vast even as the product of a patent glue, left him by a father whose ugly name on all the vacant spaces of the world had exasperated generations of men. "Oh, is he there?" asked Mrs. Ashbury, in a tone which might have been taken as a vocal rendering of the act of pricking up one's ears. She didn't hand on the information to her daughter, who was talking, if a beauty of so few phrases could have been said to talk, with Mary Gosselin, but in the course of a few moments she put down her teacup with a failure of suavity, and getting up gave the girl a poke with her parasol. "Come, Maud, we must be stirring." "You pay us a very short visit," said Mrs. Gosselin, intensely demure over the fine web of her knitting. Mrs. Ashbury looked hard for an instant into her bland eyes, then she gave poor Maud another poke. She alluded to a reason and expressed regrets, but she had got her daughter into motion, and Guy Firminger passed through the garden with the two ladies to put them into their carriage. Mrs. Ashbury protested particularly against any further escort. While he was absent, the other parent and child, sitting together on their pretty lawn in the yellow light of the August afternoon, talked of the frightful way Maud Ashbury had gone off, and of something else as to which there was more to say when the third visitor came back. "Don't think me grossly inquisitive if I ask you where they told the coachman to drive," said Mary Gosselin, as the young man dropped, near her, into a low wicker chair, stretching his long legs as if he had been one of the family. Firminger stared. "Upon my word, I didn't particularly notice, but I think the old lady said home." "There, mamma dear!" the girl exclaimed triumphantly. But Mrs. Gosselin only knitted on, persisting in profundity. She replied that home was a feint, that Mrs. Ashbury would already have given another order, and that it was her wish to hurry off to Northerly that had made her keep them from going with her to the carriage, in which they would have seen her take a suspected direction. Mary explained to Guy Firminger that her mother had perceived poor Mrs. Ashbury to be frantic to reach the house at which she had heard that Mr. Raddle was staying. The young man stared again, and wanted to know what she desired to do with Mr. Raddle. Mary replied that her mother would tell him what Mrs. Ashbury desired to do with poor Maud. "What all Christian mothers desire," said Mrs. Gosselin, "only she doesn't know how." "To marry the dear child to Mr. Raddle," Mary added, smiling. Firminger's vagueness expanded with the subject. "Do you mean you want to marry your dear child to that little cad?" he asked of the elder lady. "I speak of the general duty, not of the particular case," said Mrs. Gosselin. "Mamma does know how," Mary went on. "Then why ain't you married?" "Because we're not acting like the Ashburys, with injudicious precipitation. Is that correct?" the girl demanded, laughing, of her mother. "Laugh at me, my dear, as much as you like. It's very lucky you've got me," Mrs. Gosselin declared. "She means I can't manage for myself," said Mary to the visitor. "What nonsense you talk!" Mrs. Gosselin murmured, counting stitches. "I can't, mamma, I can't. I admit it," Mary continued. "But injudicious precipitation and—what's the other thing?—creeping prudence, seem to come out in very much the same place," the young man objected. "Do you mean since I, too, wither on the tree?" "It only comes back to saying how hard it is nowadays to marry one's daughters," said the lucid Mrs. Gosselin, saving Firminger, however, the trouble of an ingenious answer. "I don't contend that at the best it's easy." But Guy Firminger would not have struck you as capable of much conversational effort as he lounged there in the summer softness, with ironic familiarities, like one of the old friends who rarely deviate into sincerity. He was a robust but loose-limbed young man, with a well-shaped head and a face smooth, fair, and kind. He was in knickerbockers, and his clothes, which had seen service, were composed of articles that didn't match. His laced boots were dusty. He had evidently walked a certain distance, an indication confirmed by the lingering sociable way in which, in his basket seat, he tilted himself towards Mary Gosselin. It pointed to a pleasant reason for a long walk. This young lady of 25 had black hair and blue eyes, a combination often associated with the effect of beauty. The beauty in this case, however, was dim and latent, not vulgarly obvious, and if her height and slenderness gave that impression of length of line which, as we know, is the fashion, Mary Gosselin had on the other hand too much expression to be generally admired. Every one thought her intellectual. A few of the most simple-minded even thought her plain. What Guy Firminger thought, or rather what he took for granted, for he was not built up on depths of reflection, will probably appear from this narrative. "Yes, indeed, things have come to a pass that's awful for us," the girl announced. "For us, you mean," said Firminger. "We're hunted like the ostrich. We're trapped and stalked and run to earth. We go in fear. I assure you we do." "Are you hunted, Guy?" Mrs. Gosselin asked, with an inflection of her own. "Yes, Mrs. Gosselin, even moi qui vous parle, the ordinary male of commerce, inconceivable as it may appear. I know something about it." "And of whom do you go in fear?" Mary Gosselin took up an uncut book and a paper knife which she had laid down on the advent of the other visitors. "My dear child, of Diana and her nymphs, of the spinster at large. She's always out with her rifle. And it isn't only that. You know there's always a second gun, a walking arsenal, at her heels. I forget for the moment who Diana's mother was, and the genealogy of the nymphs, but not only do the old ladies know the younger ones are out, they distinctly go with them." "Who was Diana's mother, my dear?" Mrs. Gosselin inquired of her daughter. "She was a beautiful old lady with pink ribbons in her cap and a genius for knitting," the girl replied, cutting her book. "Oh, I'm not speaking of you two, dears. You're not like any one else. You're an immense comfort," said Guy Firminger. "But they've reduced it to a science, and I assure you that if one were any one in particular, if one were not protected by one's obscurity, one's life would be a burden. Upon my honour, one wouldn't escape. I've seen it. I've watched them. Look at poor Beaupre. Look at little Raddle over there. I object to him, but I bleed for him." "Lord Beaupre won't marry again," said Mrs. Gosselin with an air of conviction. "So much the worse for him." "Come, that's a concession to our charms," Mary laughed. But the ruthless young man explained away his concession. "I mean that to be married's the only protection, or else to be engaged." "To be permanently engaged, wouldn't that do?" Mary Gosselin asked. "Beautifully. I would try it if I were a parti." "And how's the little boy?" Mrs. Gosselin presently inquired. "What little boy?" "Your little cousin, Lord Beaupre's child. Isn't it a boy?" "Oh, poor little beggar, he isn't up to much. He was awfully cut up by scarlet fever." "You're not the rose indeed, but you're tolerably near it," the elder lady presently continued. "What do you call near it? Not even in the same garden, not in any garden at all, alas!" "There are 3 lives, but after all—" "Dear lady, don't be homicidal." "What do you call the rose?" Mary asked of her mother. "The title," said Mrs. Gosselin, promptly but softly. Something in her tone made Firminger laugh aloud. "You don't mention the property." "Oh, I mean the whole thing." "Is the property very large?" said Mary Gosselin. 50,000 a year," her mother responded, at which the young man laughed out again. "Take care, mamma, or we shall be thought to be out with our guns," the girl interposed, a recommendation that drew from Guy Firminger the just remark that there would be time enough for this when his prospects should be worth speaking of. He leaned over to pick up his hat and stick, as if it were time to go, but he didn't go for another quarter of an hour, and during these minutes his prospects received some frank consideration. He was Lord Beaupre's first cousin, and the 3 intervening lives were his lordship's own, that of his little sickly son, and that of his uncle the Major, who was also Guy's uncle, and with whom the young man was at present staying. It was from homely Tryst, the Major's house, that he had walked over to Mrs. Gosselin's. Frank Firminger, who had married in youth a woman with something of her own and eventually left the army, had nothing but girls, but he was only of middle age and might possibly still have a son. At any rate, his life was a very good one. Beaupre might marry again, and marry or not, he was barely 33, and might live to a great age. The child, moreover, poor little devil, would doubtless, with the growing consciousness of an incentive, there was none like feeling you were in people's way, develop a capacity for duration, so that altogether Guy professed himself, with the best will in the world, unable to take a rosy view of the disappearance of obstacles. He treated the subject with a jocularity that, in view of the remoteness of his chance, was not wholly tasteless, and the discussion between old friends, and in the light of this extravagance, was less crude than perhaps it sounds. The young man quite declined to see any latent brilliancy in his future. They had all been lashing him up, his poor dear mother, his uncle Frank, and Beaupre as well, to make that future political. But even if he should get in, he was nursing, oh so languidly, a possible opening, it would only be into the shallow edge of the stream. He would stand there like a tall idiot with the water up to his ankles. He didn't know how to swim. In that element he didn't know how to do anything. "I think you're very perverse, my dear," said Mrs. Gosselin. "I'm sure you have great dispositions." "For what, except for sitting here and talking with you and Mary? I revel in this sort of thing, but I scarcely like anything else." "You do very well, if you weren't so lazy," Mary said. "I believe you're the very laziest person in the world." "So do I, the very laziest in the world," the young man contentedly replied. "But how can I regret it when it keeps me so quiet, when, I might even say, it makes me so amiable?" "You'll have one of these days to get over your quietness, and perhaps even a little over your amiability," Mrs. Gosselin sagaciously stated. "I devoutly hope not." "You'll have to perform the duties of your position." "Do you mean keep my stump of a room in order and my crossing irreproachable?" "You may say what you like, you will be a partie," Mrs. Gosselin continued. "Well, then, if the worst comes to the worst, I shall do what I said just now. I shall get some good plausible girl to see me through." "The proper way to get her will be to marry her. After you're married you won't be a partie." "Dear mamma, he'll think you're already levelling your rifle," Mary Gosselin laughingly wailed. Guy Firminger looked at her for a moment. "I say, Mary, wouldn't you do?" "For the good plausible girl? Should I be plausible enough?" "Surely. What could be more natural? Everything would seem to contribute to the suitability of our alliance. I should be known to have known you for years, from childhood's sunny hour. I should be known to have bullied you, and even to have been bullied by you, in the period of pinafores. My revelations from a tender age with your brother, which led to our schoolroom romps and holidays, and to the happy footing on which your mother has always been so good as to receive me here, would add to all the presumptions of intimacy. People would accept such a conclusion as inevitable." "Among all your reasons you don't mention the young lady's attractions," said Mary Gosselin. Firminger stared a moment, his clear eye lighted by his happy thought. "I don't mention the young man's. They would be so obvious on one side and the other as to be taken for granted." "And is it your idea that one should pretend to be engaged to you all one's life?" "Oh no. Simply till I should have had time to look around. I'm determined not to be hustled and bewildered into matrimony, to be dragged to the shambles before I know where I am. With such an arrangement as the one I speak of, I should be able to take my time, to keep my head, to make my choice." "And how would the young lady make hers?" "How do you mean, hers?" "The selfishness of men is something exquisite. Suppose the young lady, if it's conceivable that you should find one idiotic enough to be party to such a transaction, suppose the poor girl herself should happen to wish to be really engaged." Guy Firminger thought a moment, with his slow but not stupid smile. "Do you mean to me?" "To you, or to some one else." "Oh, if she'd give me notice, I'd let her off." "Let her off till you could find a substitute?" "Yes, but I confess it would be a great inconvenience. People wouldn't take the second one so seriously." "She would have to make a sacrifice. She should have to wait till you should know where you were," Mrs. Gosselin suggested. "Yes, but where would her advantage come in?" Mary persisted. "Only in the pleasure of charity, the moral satisfaction of doing a fellow a good turn," said Firminger. "You must think people are keen to oblige you." "Ah, but surely I could count on you, couldn't I?" the young man asked. Mary had finished cutting her book. She got up and flung it down on the tea table. "What a preposterous conversation!" she exclaimed with force, tossing the words from her as she tossed her book; and looking round her vaguely a moment without meeting Guy Firminger's eye, she walked away to the house. Firminger sat watching her. Then he said serenely to her mother, "Why has our Mary left us?" "She has gone to get something, I suppose." "What has she gone to get?" "A little stick to beat you, perhaps." "You don't mean I've been objectionable?" "Dear, no. I'm joking." "One thing is very certain," pursued Mrs. Gosselin, "that you ought to work, to try to get on exactly as if nothing could ever happen. Oughtn't you?" She threw off the question mechanically as her visitor continued silent. "I'm sure she doesn't like it," he exclaimed, without heeding her appeal. "Doesn't like what?" "My free play of mind. It's perhaps too much in the key of our old romps." "You're very clever. She always likes that," said Mrs. Gosselin. "You ought to go in for something serious, for something honourable," she continued, "just as much as if you had nothing at all to look to." "Words of wisdom, dear Mrs. Gosselin," Firminger replied, rising slowly from his relaxed attitude. "But what have I to look to?" She raised her mild, deep eyes to him as he stood before her. She might have been a fairy godmother. "Everything." "But you know I can't poison them." "That won't be necessary." He looked at her an instant, and then with a laugh, "One might think you would undertake it." "I almost would, for you. Good-bye." "Take care, if they should be carried off." But Mrs. Gosselin only repeated her good-bye, and the young man departed before Mary had come back. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2 of Lord Beaupre by Henry James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Nearly 2 years after Guy Firminger had spent that friendly hour in Mrs. Gosselin's little garden in Hampshire, this far-seeing woman was enabled, by the return of her son, who at New York in an English bank occupied a position they all rejoiced over, to such great things might it duly lead, to resume possession for the season of the little London house which her husband had left her to inhabit, but which her native thrift, in determining her to let it for a term, had converted into a source of income. Hugh Gosselin, who was 30 years old, and at 23, before his father's death, had been dispatched to America to exert himself, was understood to be doing very well, so well that his devotion to the interests of his employers had been rewarded for the first time with a real holiday. He was to remain in England from May to August, undertaking, as he said, to make it all right if during this time his mother should occupy, to contribute to his entertainment, the habitation in Chester Street. He was a small, preoccupied young man, with a sharpness as acquired as a new hat. He struck his mother and sister as intensely American. For the first few days after his arrival they were startled by his intonations, though they admitted that they had had an escape when he reminded them that he might have brought with him an accent embodied in a wife. "When you do take one," said Mrs. Gosselin, who regarded such an accident, over there, as inevitable, "you must charge her high for it." It was not with this question, however, that the little family in Chester Street was mainly engaged, but with the last incident in the extraordinary succession of events which, like a chapter of romance, had in the course of a few months converted their vague and impecunious friend into a personage envied and honoured. It was as if a blight had been cast on all Guy Firminger's hindrances. On the day Hugh Gosselin sailed from New York, the delicate little boy at Bosco had succumbed to an attack of diphtheria. His father had died of typhoid the previous winter at Naples. His uncle, a few weeks later, had had a fatal accident in the hunting field. So strangely, so rapidly had the situation cleared up, had his fate and theirs worked for him. Guy had opened his eyes one morning to an earldom which carried with it a fortune not alone nominally, but really great. Mrs. Gosselin and Mary had not written to him, but they knew he was at Bosco. He had remained there after the funeral of the late little lord. Mrs. Gosselin, who heard everything, had heard somehow that he was behaving with the greatest consideration, giving the guardians, the trustees, whatever they were called, plenty of time to do everything. Everything was comparatively simple. In the absence of collaterals there were so few other people concerned. The principal relatives were poor Frank Firminger's widow and her girls, who had seen themselves so near to new honours and comforts. Probably the girls would expect their cousin Guy to marry one of them, and think it the least he could decently do, a view the young man himself, if he were very magnanimous, might possibly embrace. The question would be whether he would be very magnanimous. These young ladies exhausted in their three persons the numerous varieties of plainness. On the other hand, Guy Firminger, or Lord Beaupre, as one would have to begin to call him now, was unmistakably kind. Mrs. Gosselin appealed to her son as to whether their noble friend were not unmistakably kind. "Of course I've known him always, and that time he came out to America, when was it? 4 years ago. I saw him every day. I like him awfully and all that. But since you push me, you know," said Hugh Gosselin, "I'm bound to say that the first thing to mention in any description of him would be, if you wanted to be quite correct, that he's unmistakably selfish." I see," Mrs. Gosselin unblushingly replied. "Of course I know what you mean," she added in a moment. "But is he more so than any one else? Every one's unmistakably selfish." "Every one but you and Mary," said the young man. "And you, dear," his mother smiled. "But a person may be kind, you know, mayn't he? At the same time that he is selfish. There are different sorts." "Different sorts of kindness?" Hugh Gosselin asked with a laugh, and the inquiry undertaken by his mother occupied them for the moment, demanding a subtlety of treatment from which they were not conscious of shrinking, of which rather they had an idea that they were perhaps exceptionally capable. They came back to the temperate view that Guy would never put himself out, would probably never do anything great, but might show himself all the same a delightful member of society. Yes, he was probably selfish, like other people, but unlike most of them, he was somehow amiably, attachingly, sociably, almost lovably selfish. Without doing anything great, he would yet be a great success, a big, pleasant, gossiping, lounging, and in its way doubtless very splendid presence. He would have no ambition, and it was ambition that made selfishness ugly. Hugh and his mother were sure of this last point, until Mary, before whom the discussion, when it reached this stage, happened to be carried on, checked them by asking whether that, on the contrary, were not just what was supposed to make it fine. "Oh, he only wants to be comfortable," said her brother, "but he does want it." "There'll be a tremendous rush for him," Mrs. Gosselin prophesied to her son. "Oh, he'll never marry. It will be too much trouble." "It's done here without any trouble, for the men. One sees how long you've been out of the country." "There was a girl in New York whom he might have married. He really liked her. But he wouldn't turn round for her." "Perhaps she wouldn't turn round for him," said Mary. "I dare say she'll turn round now," Mrs. Gosselin rejoined; on which Hugh mentioned that there was nothing to be feared from her, all her revolutions had been accomplished. He added that nothing would make any difference, so intimate was his conviction that Beaupre would preserve his independence. "Then I think he's not so selfish as you say," Mary declared; "or at any rate one will never know whether he is. Isn't married life the great chance to show it?" "Your father never showed it," said Mrs. Gosselin; and as her children were silent in presence of this tribute to the departed, she added, smiling, "Perhaps you think that I did." They embraced her to indicate what they thought, and the conversation ended when she had remarked that Lord Beaupre was a man who would be perfectly easy to manage after marriage, with Hugh's exclaiming that this was doubtless exactly why he wished to keep out of it. Such was evidently his wish, as they were able to judge in Chester Street when he came up to town. He appeared there oftener than was to have been expected, not taking himself in his new character at all too seriously to find stray half-hours for old friends. It was plain that he was going to do just as he liked, that he was not a bit excited or uplifted by his change of fortune. Mary Gosselin observed that he had no imagination. She even reproached him with the deficiency to his face, an incident which showed indeed how little seriously she took him. He had no idea of playing a part, and yet he would have been clever enough. He wasn't even systematic about being simple. His simplicity was a series of accidents and indifferences. Never was a man more conscientiously superficial. There were matters on which he valued Mrs. Gosselin's judgment and asked her advice, without, as usually happened later, ever taking it. Such questions mainly as the claims of a predecessor's servants, and those in respect to social intercourse of the clergyman's family. He didn't like his parson. What was a fellow to do when he didn't like his parson? What he did like was to talk with Hugh about American investments, and it was amusing to Hugh, though he tried not to show his amusement, to find himself looking at Guy Firminger in the light of capital. To Mary he addressed from the first the oddest snatches of confidential discourse, rendered in fact, however, by the levity of his tone considerably less confidential than an intention. He had something to tell her that he joked about, yet without admitting that it was any less important for being laughable. It was neither more nor less than Charlotte Firminger, the eldest of his late uncle's 4 girls, had designated to him in the clearest manner the person she considered he ought to marry. She appealed to his sense of justice, she spoke and wrote, or at any rate she looked and moved, she sighed and sang in the name of common honesty. He had had 4 letters from her that week, and to his knowledge there were a series of people in London, people she could bully, whom she had got to promise to take her in for the season. She was going to be on the spot, she was going to follow him up. He took his stand on common honesty, but he had a mortal horror of Charlotte. At the same time, when a girl had a jaw like that, and had marked you, really marked you, mind, you felt your safety oozing away. He had given them during the past 3 months all those terrible girls, every sort of present that Bond Street could supply, but these demonstrations had only been held to constitute another pledge. Therefore, what was a fellow to do? Besides, there were other portents. The air was thick with them, as the sky over battlefields was darkened by the flight of vultures. They were flocking, the birds of prey, from every quarter, and every girl in England, by Jove, was going to be thrown at his head. What had he done to deserve such a fate? He wanted to stop in England and see all sorts of things through, but how could he stand there and face such a charge? Yet what good would it do to bolt? Wherever he should go, there would be 50 of them there first. On his honour, he couldn't say that he didn't deserve it. He had never, to his own sense, been a flirt, such a flirt at least as to have given any one a handle. He appealed candidly to Mary Gosselin to know whether his past conduct justified such penalties. "Have I been a flirt? Have I given any one a handle?" he inquired with pathetic intensity. She met his appeal by declaring that he had been awful, committing himself right and left, and this manner of treating his affliction contributed to the sarcastic publicity, as regarded the little house in Chester Street, which presently became its natural element. Lord Beaupre's comical and yet thoroughly grounded view of his danger was soon a frequent theme among the Gosselins, who, however, had their own reasons for not communicating the alarm. They had no motive for concealing their interest in their old friend, but their allusions to him among their other friends may be said on the whole to have been studied. His state of mind recalled of course to Mary and her mother the queer talk about his prospects that they had had in the country that afternoon on which Mrs. Gosselin had been so strangely prophetic. She confessed that she had had a flash of divination. The future had been mysteriously revealed to her, and poor Guy too had seen himself quite as he was to be. He had seen his nervousness, under inevitable pressure, deepen to a panic, and he now, in intimate hours, made no attempt to disguise that a panic had become his portion. It was a fixed idea with him that he should fall a victim to woven toils, to be caught in a trap constructed with superior science. The science evolved in an enterprising age by this branch of industry, the manufacture of the trap matrimonial, he had terrible anecdotes to illustrate. And what had he on his lips but a scientific term when he declared, as he perpetually did, that it was his fate to be hypnotized? Mary Gosselin reminded him, they each in turn reminded him, that his safeguard was to fall in love. Were he once to put himself under that protection, all the mothers and maids in Mayfair would not prevail against him. He replied that this was just the impossibility. It took leisure and calmness and opportunity and a free mind to fall in love, and never was a man less open to such experiences. He was literally fighting his way. He reminded the girl of his old fancy for pretending already to have disposed of his hand if he could put that hand on a young person who should like him well enough to be willing to participate in the fraud. She would have to place herself in rather a false position, of course, have to take a certain amount of trouble, but there would, after all, be a good deal of fun in it. There was always fun in duping the world, between the pair themselves, the two happy comedians. "Why should they both be happy?" Mary Gosselin asked. "I understand why you should, but frankly I don't quite grasp the reason of her pleasure." Lord Beaupre, with his sunny human eyes, thought a moment. "Why, for the lark, as they say, and that sort of thing. I should be awfully nice to her." "She would require indeed to be in want of recreation." "Ah, but I should want a good sort. A quiet, reasonable one, you know," he somewhat eagerly interposed. "You're too delightful!" Mary Gosselin exclaimed, continuing to laugh. He thanked her for this appreciation, and she returned to her point, that she didn't really see the advantage his accomplice could hope to enjoy as her compensation for extreme disturbance. Guy Firminger stared. "But what extreme disturbance?" "Why, it would take a lot of time. It might become intolerable." "You mean I ought to pay her? To hire her for the season?" Mary Gosselin considered him a moment. "Wouldn't marriage come cheaper at once?" she asked with a quieter smile. "You're chaffing me," he sighed forgivingly. "Of course she would have to be good-natured enough to pity me. Pity's akin to love. If she were good-natured enough to want so to help you, she'd be good-natured enough to marry you. That would be her idea of help." "Would it be yours?" Lord Beaupre asked rather eagerly. "You're too absurd. You must sail your own boat," the girl answered, turning away. That evening at dinner she stated to her companions that she had never seen a fatuity so dense, so serene, so preposterous as his lordship's. "Fatuity, my dear! What do you mean?" her mother inquired. "Oh, mamma, you know perfectly." Mary Gosselin spoke with a certain impatience. "If you mean he's conceited, I'm bound to say I don't agree with you," her brother observed. "He's too indifferent to every one's opinion for that." "He's not vain, he's not proud, he's not pompous," said Mrs. Gosselin. Mary was silent a moment. "He takes more things for granted than any one I ever saw." "What sort of things?" "Well, one's interest in his affairs." "With old friends, surely a gentleman may." "Of course," said Hugh Gosselin, "old friends have in turn the right to take for granted a corresponding interest on his part." "Well, who could be nicer to us than he is, or come to see us oftener?" his mother asked. "He comes exactly for the purpose I speak of, to talk about himself," said Mary. "There are thousands of girls who would be delighted with his talk," Mrs. Gosselin returned. "We agreed long ago that he's intensely selfish," the girl went on, "and if I speak of it to day, it's not because that in itself is anything of a novelty. What I'm freshly struck with is simply that he more shamelessly shows it." "He shows it exactly," said Hugh. "He shows all there is. There it is, on the surface; there are not depths of it underneath." "He's not hard," Mrs. Gosselin contended. "He's not impervious." "Do you mean he's soft?" Mary asked. "I mean he's yielding." And Mrs. Gosselin, with considerable expression, looked across at her daughter. She added, before they rose from dinner, that poor Beaupre had plenty of difficulties, and that she thought, for her part, they ought in common loyalty to do what they could to assist him. For a week nothing more passed between the two ladies on the subject of their noble friend, and in the course of this week they had the amusement of receiving in Chester Street a member of Hugh's American circle, Mr. Bolton Brown, a young man from New York. He was a person engaged in large affairs, for whom Hugh Gosselin professed the highest regard, from whom in New York he had received much hospitality, and for whose advent he had from the first prepared his companions. Mrs. Gosselin begged the amiable stranger to stay with them, and if she failed to overcome his hesitation, it was because his hotel was near at hand, and he should be able to see them often. It became evident that he would do so, and to the two ladies, as the days went by, equally evident that no objection to such a relation was likely to arise. Mr. Bolton Brown was delightfully fresh. The most usual expressions acquired on his lips a well-nigh comical novelty; the most superficial sentiments, in the look with which he accompanied them, a really touching sincerity. He was unmarried and good-looking, clever and natural, and if he was not very rich, was at least very free-handed. He literally strewed the path of the ladies in Chester Street with flowers; he choked them with French confectionery. Hugh, however, who was often rather mysterious on monetary questions, placed in a light sufficiently clear the fact that his friend had in Wall Street (they knew all about Wall Street) improved each shining hour. They introduced him to Lord Beaupre, who thought him "tremendous fun," as Hugh said, and who immediately declared that the four must spend a Sunday at Bosco a week or two later. The date of this visit was fixed. Mrs. Gosselin had uttered a comprehensive acceptance; but after Guy Firminger had taken leave of them (this had been his first appearance since the odd conversation with Mary), our young lady confided to her mother that she should not be able to join the little party. She expressed the conviction that it would be all that was essential if Mrs. Gosselin should go with the two others. On being pressed to communicate the reason for this aloofness, Mary was able to give no better one than that she had never cared for Bosco. "What makes you hate him so?" her mother presently broke out, in a tone which brought the red to the girl's cheek. Mary denied that she entertained for Lord Beaupre any sentiment so intense; to which Mrs. Gosselin rejoined with some sternness, and, no doubt, considerable wisdom: "Look out what you do then, or you'll be thought by everybody to be in love with him." CHAPter 3. Chapter 3 of Lord Beaupre by Henry James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. I know not whether it was this danger, that of appearing to be moved to extremes, that weighed with Mary Gosselin. At any rate, when the day arrived, she had decided to be perfectly colourless and take her share of Lord Beaupre's hospitality. On perceiving that the house, when with her companions she reached it, was full of visitors, she consoled herself with the sense that such a share would be of the smallest. She even wondered whether its smallness might not be caused in some degree by the sufficiently startling presence, in this stronghold of the single life, of Maud Ashbury and her mother. It was true that during the Saturday evening she never saw their host address an observation to them, but she was struck, as she had been struck before, with the girl's cold and magnificent beauty. It was very well to say she had gone off. Still, she was handsomer than any one else. She had failed in everything she had tried. The campaign undertaken with so much energy against young Rattle had been conspicuously disastrous. Young Rattle had married his grandmother, or a person who might have filled such an office, and Maud was a year older, a year more disappointed, and a year more ridiculous. Nevertheless, one could scarcely believe that a creature with such advantages would always fail, though indeed the poor girl was stupid enough to be a warning. Perhaps it would be at Bosco, or with the master of Bosco, that fate had appointed her to succeed. Except Mary herself, she was the only young unmarried woman on the scene, and Mary glowed with the generous sense of not being a competitor. She felt as much out of question as the blooming wives, the heavy matrons who formed the rest of the female contingent. Before the evening closed, however, her host, who, she saw, was delightful in his own house, mentioned to her that he had a couple of guests who had not been invited. Not invited? They drove up to my door as they might have done to an inn. They asked for rooms and complained of those that were given them. Don't pretend not to know who they are. Do you mean the Ashburys? How amusing! Don't laugh. It freezes my blood. Do you really mean you're afraid of them? I tremble like a leaf. Some monstrous, ineluctable fate seems to look at me out of their eyes. That's because you secretly admire Maud. How can you help it? She's extremely good-looking, and if you get rid of her mother she'll become a very nice girl. It's an odious thing, no doubt, to say about a young person under one's own roof, but I don't think I ever saw any one who happened to be less to my taste, said Guy Firminger. I don't know why I don't turn them out even now. Mary persisted in sarcasm. Perhaps you can make her have a worse time by letting her stay. Please don't laugh, her interlocutor repeated. Such a fact as I have mentioned to you seems to me to speak volumes, to show you what my life is. Oh, your life, Mary Gosselin murmured, with her mocking note. Don't you agree that at any rate it may easily become impossible? Many people would change with you. I don't see what there is for you to do but to bear your cross. That's easy talk, Lord Beaupre sighed. Especially for me, do you mean? How do you know I don't bear mine? Yours? He asked vaguely. How do you know that I'm not persecuted, that my footsteps are not dogged, that my life isn't a burden? They were walking in the old gardens, the proprietor of which, at this, stopped short. Do you mean by fellows who want to marry you? His tone produced on his companion's part an irrepressible peal of hilarity, but she walked on as she exclaimed, "You speak as if there couldn't be such madmen." "Of course, such a charming girl must be made up to," Guy Firminger conceded as he overtook her. "I don't speak of it. I keep quiet about it." "You realise then, at any rate, that it's all horrid when you don't care for them?" "I suffer in silence because I know there are worse tribulations. It seems to me you ought to remember that," Mary continued. "Your cross is small compared with your crown. You've everything in the world that most people most desire, and I'm bound to say that I think your life is made very comfortable for you. If you're oppressed by the quantity of interest and affection you inspire, You ought simply to make up your mind to bear up and be cheerful under it." Lord Beaupre received this admonition with perfect good humour. He professed himself to be able to do it full justice. He remarked that he would gladly give up some of his material advantages to be a little less badgered, and that he had been quite content with his former insignificance. No doubt, however, such annoyances were the essential drawbacks of ponderous promotions. One had to pay for everything. Mary was quite right to rebuke him. Her own attitude, as a young woman much admired, was a lesson to his irritability. She cut this appreciation short, speaking of something else, but a few minutes later he broke out irrelevantly: "Why, if you are hunted as well as I, that dodge I proposed to you would be just the thing for us both." He had evidently been reasoning it out. Mary Gosselin was silent at first. She only paused gradually in their walk, at a point where 4 long alleys met. In the centre of the circle, on a massive pedestal, rose in Italian bronze a florid, complicated image, so that the place made a charming old-world picture. The grounds of Bosco were stately without stiffness, and full of marble terraces and misty avenues. The fountains in particular were royal. The girl had told her mother in London that she disliked this fine residence, but she now looked round her with a vague, pleased sigh, holding up her glass (she had been condemned to wear one, with a long handle, since she was 15), to consider the weather-stained garden group. "What a perfect place of its kind!" she musingly exclaimed. "Wouldn't it really be just the thing?" Lord Beaupre went on, with the eagerness of his idea. "Wouldn't what be just the thing?" "Why, the defensive alliance we've already talked of. You wanted to know the good it would do you. Now you see the good it would do you." "I don't like practical jokes," said Mary. "The remedy's worse than the disease," she added, and she began to follow one of the paths that took the direction of the house. Poor Lord Beaupre was absurdly in love with his invention. He had all an inventor's importunity. He kept up his attempt to place his dodge in a favourable light, in spite of a further objection from his companion, who assured him that it was one of those contrivances which break down in practice in just the proportion in which they make a figure in theory. At last she said, "I was not sincere just now when I told you I'm worried. I'm not worried." "They don't buzz about you?" Guy Firminger asked. She hesitated an instant. "They buzz about me, but at bottom it's flattering, and I don't mind it. Now, please drop the subject." He dropped the subject, though not without congratulating her on the fact that, unlike his infirm self, she could keep her head and her temper. His infirmity found a trap laid for it before they had proceeded 20 yards, as was proved by his sudden exclamation of horror: "Good heavens! If there isn't Lottie!" Mary perceived, in effect, in the distance, a female figure coming towards them over a stretch of lawn, and she simultaneously saw, as a gentleman passed from behind a clump of shrubbery, that it was not unattended. She recognised Charlotte Firminger, and she also distinguished the gentleman. She was moved to larger mirth at the dismay expressed by poor Firminger, but she was able to articulate, "Walking with Mr. Brown." Lord Beaupre stopped again before they were joined by the pair. "Does he buzz about you?" "Mercy, what questions you ask!" his companion exclaimed. "Does he, please?" the young man repeated, with odd intensity. Mary looked at him an instant. She was puzzled by the deep annoyance that had flushed through the essential good humour of his face. Then she saw that this annoyance had exclusive reference to poor Charlotte, so that it left her free to reply with another laugh: "Well, yes, he does. But you know, I like it." "I don't, then." Before she could have asked him, even had she wished to, in what manner such a circumstance concerned him, he added with his droll agitation: "I never invited her either. Don't let her get at me." "What can I do?" Mary demanded, as the others advanced. "Please take her away. Keep her yourself. "I'll take the American. I'll keep him," he murmured inconsequently as a bribe. "But I don't object to him." "Do you like him so much?" "Very much indeed," the girl replied. The reply was perhaps lost upon her interlocutor, whose eye now fixed itself gloomily on the dauntless Charlotte. As Miss Firminger came nearer, he exclaimed almost loud enough for her to hear, "I think I shall murder her some day." Mary Gosling's first impression had been that, in his panic, under the empire of that fixed idea to which he confessed himself subject, he attributed to his kinswoman machinations and aggressions of which she was incapable, an impression that might have been confirmed by this young lady's decorous placidity, her passionless eyes, her expressionless cheeks and colourless tones. She was ugly, yet she was orthodox. She was not what writers of books called intense. But after Mary, to oblige their host, had tried successfully enough to be crafty, had drawn her on to stroll a little in advance of the two gentlemen, she became promptly aware, by the mystical influence of propinquity, that Miss Firminger was indeed full of views, of a purpose single, simple, and strong, which gave her the effect of a person carrying with a stiff, steady hand, with eyes fixed and lips compressed, a cup charged to the brim. She had driven over to lunch, driven from somewhere in the neighbourhood. She had picked up some weak woman as an escort. Mary, though she knew the neighbourhood, failed to recognise her base of operations, and, as Charlotte was not specific, ended by suspecting that, far from being entertained by friends, she had put up at an inn and hired a fly. This suspicion startled her. It gave her for the first time something of the measure of the passions engaged, and she wondered to what the insecurity complained of by Guy might lead. Charlotte, on arriving, had gone through a part of the house in quest of its master, the servants being unable to tell her where he was, and she had finally come upon Mr. Bolton Brown, who was looking at old books in the library. He had placed himself at her service, as if he had been trained immediately to recognise in such a case his duty, and informing her that he believed Lord Beaupre to be in the grounds, had come out with her to help find him. Lottie Firminger questioned her companion about this accommodating person. She intimated that he was rather odd, but rather nice. Mary mentioned to her that Lord Beaupre thought highly of him. She believed they were going somewhere together. At this Miss Firminger turned round to look for them, but they had already disappeared, and the girl became ominously dumb. Mary wondered afterwards what profit she could hope to derive from such proceedings. They struck her own sense, naturally, as disreputable and desperate. She was equally unable to discover the compensation they offered, in another variety, to poor Maud Ashbury, whom Lord Beaupre, the greater part of the day, neglected as conscientiously as he neglected his cousin. She asked herself if he should be blamed, and replied that the others should be blamed first. He got rid of Charlotte somehow after tea. She had to fall back to her mysterious lines. Mary knew this method would have been detestable to him. He hated to force his friendly nature. She was sorry for him, and wished to lose sight of him. She wished not to be mixed up even indirectly with his tribulations, and the fevered faces of the Ashburys were particularly dreadful to her. She spent as much of the long summer afternoon as possible out of the house, which indeed on such an occasion emptied itself of most of its inmates. Mary Gosselin asked her brother to join her in a devious ramble. She might have had other society, but she was in a mood to prefer his. These two were great chums, and they had been separated so long that they had arrears of talk to make up. They had been at Bosco more than once, and though Hugh Gosselin said that the land of the free, which, he had assured his sister, was even more enslaved than dear old England, made one forget there were such spots on earth. They both remembered, a couple of miles away, a little ancient church to which the walk across the fields would be the right thing. They talked of other things as they went, and among them they talked of Mr. Bolton Brown, in regard to whom Hugh, as scantily addicted to enthusiasm as to bursts of song (he was determined not to be taken in), became, in commendation, almost lyrical. Mary asked him what he had done with his paragon, and he replied that he believed him to have gone out stealthily to sketch. They might come across him. He was extraordinarily clever at water-colours, but haunted with the fear that the public practice of such an art on Sunday was viewed with disfavour in England. Mary exclaimed that this was the respectable fact, and when her brother ridiculed the idea, she told him she had already noticed he had lost all sense of things at home, so that Mr. Bolton Brown was apparently a better Englishman than he. "He is indeed. He's awfully artificial," Hugh returned. But it must be added that in spite of this rigour, their American friend, when they reached the goal of their walk, was to be perceived in an irregular attitude in the very churchyard. He was perched on an old flat tomb, with a box of colours beside him, and a sketch half completed. Hugh asserted that this exercise was the only thing Mr. Bolton Brown really cared for, but the young man protested against the imputation in the face of an achievement so modest. He showed his sketch to Mary, however, and it consoled her for not having kept up her own experiments. She never could make her trees so leafy. He had found a lovely bit on the other side of the hill, a bit he should like to come back to, and he offered to show it to his friends. They were on the point of starting with him to look at it, when Hugh Gosselin, taking out his watch, remembered the hour at which he had promised to be at the house again to give his mother, who wanted a little mild exercise, his arm. His sister, at this, said she would go back with him, but Bolton Brown interposed an earnest inquiry. Mightn't she let Hugh keep his appointment and let him take her over the hill and bring her home? Happy thought. Do that, said Hugh, with a crudity that showed the girl how completely he had lost his English sense. He perceived, however, in an instant that she was embarrassed, whereupon he went on, "My dear child, I've walked with girls so often in America that we really ought to let poor Brown walk with one in England." I know not if it was the effect of this plea or that of some further eloquence of their friend. At any rate, Mary Gosselin, in the course of another minute, had accepted the accident of Hugh's secession, had seen him depart with an injunction to her to render it clear to poor Brown that he had made quite a monstrous request. As she went over the hill with her companion, she reflected that since she had granted the request, it was not in her interest to pretend that she had gone out of her way. She wondered, moreover, whether her brother had wished to throw them together. It suddenly occurred to her that the whole incident might have been prearranged. The idea made her a little angry with Hugh. It led her, however, to entertain no resentment against the other party, if party Mr. Brown had been, to the transaction. He told her all the delight that certain sweet old corners of rural England excited in his mind, and she liked him for hovering near some of her own secrets. Hugh Gosselin, meanwhile, at Bosco, strolling the terrace with his mother, who preferred walks that were as slow as conspiracies, and had had much to say to him about his extraordinary indiscretion, repeated over and over, it ended by irritating her, that as he himself had been out for hours with American girls, it was only fair to let their friend have a turn with an English one. "Pay as much as you like, but don't pay with your sister," Mrs. Gosselin replied, while Hugh submitted that it was just his sister who was required to make the payment his. She turned his logic to easy scorn, and she waited on the terrace till she had seen the two explorers reappear. When the ladies went to dress for dinner, she expressed to her daughter her extreme disapproval of such conduct, and Mary did nothing more to justify herself than to exclaim at first, "Poor dear man," and then to say, "I was afraid you wouldn't like it." There were reservations in her silence that made Mrs. Gosselin uneasy, and she was glad that at dinner Mr. Bolton Brown had to take in Mrs. Ashbury. It served him so right. This arrangement had, in Mrs. Gosselin's eyes, the added merit of serving Mrs. Ashbury right. She was more uneasy than ever when, after dinner in the drawing-room, she saw Mary sit for a period on the same small sofa with the culpable American. This young couple leaned back together familiarly, and their conversation had the air of being desultory without being in the least difficult. At last she quitted her place and went over to them, remarking to Mr. Bolton Brown that she wanted him to come and talk a bit to her. She conducted him to another part of the room, which was vast and animated by scattered groups, and held him there, very persuasively, quite maternally, till the approach of the hour at which the ladies would exchange looks and murmur good nights. She made him talk about America, though he wanted to talk about England, and she judged that she gave him an impression of the kindest intention, although she was really thinking in alternation of three important things. One of these was a circumstance of which she had become conscious only just after sitting down with him, the prolonged absence of Lord Beaupre from the drawing-room. The second was the absence, equally marked, to her imagination, of Maud Ashbury. The third was a matter different altogether. England gives one such a sense of immemorial continuity, something that drops like a plummet line into the past, said the young American, ingeniously exerting himself, while Mrs. Gosselin, rigidly contemporaneous, strayed into deserts of conjecture. Had the fact that their host was out of the room any connection with the fact that the most beautiful, even though the most suicidal, of his satellites had quitted it? Yet if poor Guy was taking a turn by starlight on the terrace with the misguided girl, what had he done with his resentment at her invasion, and by what inspiration of despair had Maud achieved such a triumph? The good lady studied Mrs. Ashbury's face across the room. She decided that triumph, accompanied perhaps with a shade of nervousness, looked out of her insincere eyes. An intelligent consciousness of ridicule was at any rate less present in them than ever. While Mrs. Gosselin had her infallible finger on the pulse of the occasion, one of the doors opened to readmit Lord Beaupre, who struck her as pale, and who immediately approached Mrs. Ashbury with a remark evidently intended for herself alone. It led this lady to rise with a movement of dismay, and after a question or two leave the room. Lord Beaupre left it again in her company. Mr. Bolton Brown had also noticed the incident. His conversation languished, and he asked Mrs. Gosselin if she supposed anything had happened. She turned it over a moment, and then she said, "Yes, something will have happened to Miss Ashbury." "What do you suppose? Is she ill?" "I don't know. We shall see. They're capable of anything." "Capable of anything?" "I've guessed it. She wants to have a grievance." "A grievance?" Mr. Bolton Brown was mystified. "Of course you don't understand. How should you? Moreover, it doesn't signify. But I'm so vexed with him he's a very old friend of ours that really, though I dare say I'm indiscreet, I can't speak civilly of them." "Miss Ashbury's a wonderful type," said the young American. This remark appeared to irritate his companion. "I see perfectly what has happened. She has made a scene." "A scene?" Mr. Bolton Brown was terribly out of it. "She has tried to be injured, to provoke him, I mean, to some act of impatience, to some failure of temper, of courtesy. She has asked him if he wishes her to leave the house at midnight, and he may have answered, but no, he wouldn't." Mrs. Gosselin suppressed the wild supposition. "How you read it! She looks so quiet." "Her mother has coached her, and I won't pretend to say exactly what has happened. They've done, somehow, what they wanted. They've got him to do something that he'll have to make up for." "What an evolution of ingenuity!" the young man laughed. "It often answers." "Will it in this case?" Mrs. Gosselin was silent a moment. "It may." "Really, you think?" "I mean it might if it weren't for something else." "I'm too judicious to ask what that is." "I'll tell you when we're back in town," said Mrs. Gosselin, getting up. Lord Beaupre was restored to them, and the ladies prepared to withdraw. Before she went to bed, Mrs. Gosselin asked him if there had been anything the matter with Maud, to which he replied with abysmal blankness (she had never seen him wear just that face) that he was afraid Miss Ashbury was ill. She proved, in fact, in the morning too unwell to return to London, a piece of news communicated to Mrs. Gosselin at breakfast. "She'll have to stay. I can't turn her out of the house," said Guy Firminger. "Very well, let her stay her fill." "I wish you would stay too," the young man went on. "Do you mean to nurse her?" "No, her mother must do that. I mean to keep me company." "You? You're not going up?" "I think I had better wait over to day, or long enough to see what's the matter." "Don't you know what's the matter?" He was silent a moment. "I may have been nasty last night." "You have compunctions? You're too good-natured." "I daresay I hit rather wild. It will look better for me to stop over 24 hours." Mrs. Gosselin fixed her eyes on a distant object. "Let no one ever say you're selfish." "Does any one ever say it?" "You're too generous, you're too soft, you're too foolish. But if it will give you any pleasure, Mary and I will wait till to-morrow." "And Hugh too, won't he? And Bolton Brown?" "Hugh will do as he pleases. But don't keep the American." "Why not? He's all right." "That's why I want him to go," said Mrs. Gosselin, who could treat a matter with candour just as she could treat it with humour at the right moment. The party at Bosco broke up, and there was a general retreat to town. Hugh Gosselin pleaded pressing business; he accompanied the young American to London. His mother and sister came back on the morrow, and Bolton Brown went in to see them, as he often did, at tea-time. He found Mrs. Gosselin alone in the drawing-room, and she took such a convenient occasion to mention to him what she had withheld on the eve of their departure from Bosco, the reason why poor Maud Ashbury's frantic assault on the master of that property would be vain. He was greatly surprised, the more so that Hugh hadn't told him. Mrs. Gosselin replied that Hugh didn't know. She had not seen him all day, and it had only just come out. Hugh's friend, at any rate, was deeply interested, and his interest took for several minutes the form of a throbbing silence. At last Mrs. Gosselin heard a sound below, on which she said quickly, "That's Hugh. I'll tell him now." She left the room with the request that their visitor would wait for Mary, who would be down in a moment. During the instants that he spent alone, the visitor lurched, as if he had been on a deck in a blow, to the window, and stood there with his hands in his pockets, staring vacantly into Chester Street. Then, turning away, he gave himself, with an odd ejaculation, an impatient shake which had the effect of enabling him to meet Mary Gosselin composedly enough when she came in. It took her mother apparently some time to communicate the news to Hugh, so that Bolton Brown had a considerable margin for nervousness and hesitation before he could say to the girl, abruptly, but with an attempt at a voice properly gay, "You must let me very heartily congratulate you." Mary stared. "On what?" "On your engagement." "My engagement?" "To Lord Beaupre." Mary Gosselin looked strange. She coloured. "Who told you I'm engaged?" "Your mother, just now." "Oh!" the girl exclaimed, turning away. She went and rang the bell for fresh tea, rang it with noticeable force. But she said, "Thank you very much," before the servant came. Chapter 4 of Lord Beaupre by Henry James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Bolton Brown did something that evening toward disseminating the news. He told it to the first people he met socially after leaving Chester Street. And this, although he had to do himself a certain violence in speaking. He would have preferred to hold his peace. Therefore, if he resisted his inclination, it was for an urgent purpose. This purpose was to prove to himself that he didn't mind. A perfect indifference could be for him the only result of any understanding Mary Gosselin might arrive at with any one, and he wanted to be more and more conscious of his indifference. He was aware, indeed, that it required demonstration, and this was why he was almost feverishly active. He could mentally concede, at least, that he had been surprised, for he had suspected nothing at Bosco. When a fellow was attentive in America, every one knew it, and judged by this standard, Lord Beaupre made no show. How otherwise should he have achieved that sweet accompanied ramble? Everything at any rate was lucid now, except perhaps a certain ambiguity in Hugh Gosselin, who, on coming into the drawing-room with his mother, had looked flushed and grave, and had stayed only long enough to kiss Mary and go out again. There had been nothing effusive in the scene, but then there was nothing effusive in any English scene. This helped to explain why Miss Gosselin had been so blank during the minutes she spent with him before her mother came back. He himself wanted to cultivate tranquillity, and he felt that he did so the next day in not going again to Chester Street. He went instead to the British Museum, where he sat quite like an elderly gentleman, with his hands crossed on the top of his stick, and his eyes fixed on an Assyrian bull. When he came away, however, it was with the resolution to move briskly, so that he walked westward the whole length of Oxford Street, and arrived at the Marble Arch. He stared for some minutes at this monument, as in the National Collection he had stared at even less intelligible ones. Then, brushing away the apprehension that he should meet two persons riding together, he passed into the Park. He didn't care a straw whom he met. He got upon the grass and made his way to the southern expanse, and when he reached the Row he dropped into a chair, rather tired, to watch the capering procession of riders. He watched it with a lustreless eye, for what he seemed mainly to extract from it was a vivification of his disappointment. He had had a hope that he should not be forced to leave London without inducing Mary Gosselin to ride with him. But that prospect failed, for what he had accomplished in the British Museum was the determination to go to Paris. He tried to think of the attractions supposed to be evoked by that name, and while he was so engaged he recognized that a gentleman on horseback, close to the barrier of the Row, was making a sign to him. The gentleman was Lord Beaupre, who had pulled up his horse, and whose sign the young American lost no time in obeying. He went forward to speak to his late host, but during the instant of the transit he was able both to observe that Mary Gosselin was not in sight, and to ask himself why she was not. She rode with her brother; why then didn't she ride with her future husband? It was singular at such a moment to see her future husband disporting himself alone. This personage conversed a few moments with Bolton Brown, said it was too hot to ride, but that he ought to be mounted. He would give him a mount if he liked, and was on the point of turning away when his interlocutor succumbed to the temptation to put his modesty to the test. "Good-bye, but let me congratulate you first," said Bolton Brown. "Congratulate me? On what?" His look, his tone, were very much what Mary Gosselin's had been. "Why, on your engagement. Haven't you heard of it?" Lord Beaupre stared a moment while his horse shifted uneasily. Then he laughed and said, "Which of them do you mean?" "There's only one I know anything about. To Miss Gosselin," Brown added, after a puzzled pause. "Oh yes, I see. Thanks so much." With this, letting his horse go, Lord Beaupre broke off, while Bolton Brown stood looking after him, and saying to himself that perhaps he didn't know. The chapter of English oddities was long. But on the morrow the announcement was in the Morning Post, and that surely made it authentic. It was doubtless only superficially singular that Guy Firminger should have found himself unable to achieve a call in Chester Street until this journal had been for several hours in circulation. He appeared there just before luncheon, and the first person who received him was Mrs. Gosselin. He had always liked her, finding her infallible on the question of behaviour, but he was on this occasion more than ever struck with her ripe astuteness, her independent wisdom. "I knew what you wanted. I knew what you needed. I knew the subject on which you had pressed her," the good lady said. "And after Sunday I found myself really haunted with your dangers. There was danger in the air at Bosco, in your own defended house. It seemed to me too monstrous. I said to myself, 'We can help him, poor dear, and we must. It's the least one can do for so old and so good a friend.' I decided what to do. I simply put this other story about. In London that always answers. I knew that Mary pitied you really as much as I do, and that what she saw at Bosco had been a revelation, had at any rate brought your situation home to her. Yet of course she would be shy about saying out for herself, 'Here I am, I'll do what you want.' The thing was for me to say it for her, so I said it first to that chattering American. He repeated it to several others, and there you are. I just forced her hand a little, but it's all right. All she has to do is not to contradict it. It won't be any trouble, and you'll be comfortable. That will be our reward," smiled Mrs. Gosselin. "Yes, all she has to do is not to contradict it," Lord Beaupre replied, musing a moment. "It won't be any trouble," he added, "and I hope I shall be comfortable." He thanked Mrs. Gosselin formally and liberally, and expressed all his impatience to assure Mary herself of his deep obligation to her, upon which his hostess promised to send her daughter to him on the instant. She would go and call her, so that they might be alone. Before Mrs. Gosselin left him, however, she touched on one or two points that had their little importance. Guy Firminger had asked for Hugh, but Hugh had gone to the city, and his mother mentioned candidly that he didn't take part in the game. She even disclosed his reason. He thought there was a want of dignity in it. Lord Beaupre stared at this, and after a moment exclaimed, "Dignity? Dignity be hanged! One must save one's life." "Yes, but the point poor Hugh makes is that one must save it by the use of one's own wits, or one's own arms and legs. But you know what I said to him?" Mrs. Gosselin continued. "Something very clever, I dare say." "That if we were drowning, you'd be the very first to jump in. And we may fall overboard yet." Fidgeting there with his hands in his pockets, Lord Beaupre gave a laugh at this, but assured her that there was nothing in the world for which they mightn't count upon him. None the less, she just permitted herself another warning, a warning, it is true, that it was in his own interest, a reminder of a peril that he ought beforehand to look in the face. Wasn't there always a chance, just the bare chance, that a girl in Mary's position would, in the event, decline to let him off, decline to release him even on the day he should wish to marry? She wasn't speaking of Mary, but there were, of course, girls who would play him that trick. Guy Firminger considered this contingency. Then he declared that it wasn't a question of girls. It was simply a question of dear old Mary. If she should wish to hold him, so much the better. He would do anything in the world that she wanted. "Don't let us dwell on such vulgarities, but I had it on my conscience," Mrs. Gosselin wound up. She left him, but at the end of 3 minutes Mary came in, and the first thing she said was, "Before you speak a word, please understand this, that it's wholly mamma's doing. I hadn't dreamed of it, but she suddenly began to tell people." "It was charming of her, and it's charming of you," the visitor cried. "It's not charming of any one, I think," said Mary Gosselin, looking at the carpet. "It's simply idiotic." "Don't be nasty about it. It will be tremendous fun." "I've only consented because mamma says we owe it to you," the girl went on. "Never mind your reason. The end justifies the means. I can never thank you enough, nor tell you what a weight it lifts off my shoulders. Do you know, I feel the difference already? A peace that passeth understanding." Mary replied that this was childish. How could such a feeble fiction last? At the very best, it could live but an hour, and then he would be no better off than before. It would bristle, moreover, with difficulties and absurdities. It would be so much more trouble than it was worth. She reminded him that so ridiculous a service had never been asked of any girl, and at this he seemed a little struck. He said, ah, well, If it's positively disagreeable to you, we'll instantly drop the idea. But I thought you really liked me enough—" She turned away impatiently, and he went on to argue imperturbably that she had always treated him in the kindest way in the world. He added that the worst was over, the start; they were off; the thing would be in all the evening papers. Wasn't it much simpler to accept it? That was all they would have to do, and all she would have to do would be not to gainsay it, and to smile and thank people when she was congratulated. She would have to act a little, but that would just be part of the fun. Oh, he hadn't the shadow of a scruple about taking the world in. The world deserved it richly, and she couldn't deny that this was what she had felt for him, that she had really been moved to compassion. He grew eloquent, and charged her with having recognized in his predicament a genuine motive for charity. Their little plot would last what it could. It would be a part of their amusement to make it last. Even if it should be but a thing of a day, there would have been always so much gained. But they would be ingenious, they would find ways, they would have no end of sport. "You must be ingenious, I can't," said Mary. "If people scarcely ever see us together, they'll guess we're trying to humbug them." "But they will see us together. We are together. We've been together. I mean, we've seen a lot of each other all our lives." "Ah, not that way." "Oh, trust me to work it right," cried the young man, whose imagination had now evidently begun to glow in the air of their pious fraud. "You'll find it a dreadful bore," said Mary Gosselin. "Then I'll drop it, don't you see? And you'll drop it, of course, the moment you've had enough," Lord Beaupre punctually added. "But as soon as you begin to realize what a lot of good you do me, you won't want to drop it. That is, if you're what I take you for," laughed his lordship. If a third person had been present at this conversation, and there was nothing in it surely that might not have been spoken before a trusty listener, that person would perhaps have thought, from the immediate expression of Mary Gosselin's face, that she was on the point of exclaiming, "You take me for too big a fool." No such ungracious words, in fact, however, passed her lips. She only said, after an instant, "What reason do you propose to give, on the day you need one, for our rupture?" Her interlocutor stared. "To you, do you mean?" "I shan't ask you for one. I mean to other people." "Oh, I'll tell them you're sick of me. I'll put everything on you, and you'll put everything on me." "You have it worked out!" Mary exclaimed. "Oh, I shall be intensely considerate." "Do you call that being considerate? Publicly accusing me?" Guy Firminger stared again. "Why, isn't that the reason you'll give?" She looked at him an instant. "I won't tell you the reason I shall give." "Oh, I shall learn it from others." "I hope you'll like it when you do," said Mary, with sudden gaiety; and she added frankly, though kindly, the hope that he might soon light upon some young person who would really meet his requirements. He replied that he shouldn't be in a hurry; that was just now the comfort; and she, as if thinking over to the end the list of arguments against his clumsy contrivance, broke out, "And of course you mustn't dream of giving me anything, any tokens or presents." "Then it won't look natural." "That's exactly what I say. You can't make it deceive anybody." "I must give you something that people can see. There must be some evidence. You can simply put my offerings away after a little and give them back." But about this Mary was visibly serious. She declared that she wouldn't touch anything that came from his hand, and she spoke in such a tone that he colored a little, and hastened to say, "Oh, all right, I shall be thoroughly careful." This appeared to complete their understanding, so that after it was settled that for the deluded world they were engaged, there was obviously nothing for him to do but to go. He therefore shook hands with her very gratefully and departed. Chapter 5 of Lord Beaupre. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. He was able promptly to assure his accomplice that their little plot was working to a charm. It already made such a difference for the better. Only a week had elapsed, but he felt quite another man. His life was no longer spent in springing to arms, and he had ceased to sleep in his boots. The ghost of his great fear was laid. He could follow out his inclinations and attend to his neglected affairs. The news had been a bomb in the enemy's camp, and there were plenty of blank faces to testify to the confusion it had wrought. Every one was sold, and every one made haste to clap him on the back. Lottie Firminger only had written in terms of which no notice could be taken, though of course he expected, every time he came in, to find her waiting in his hall. Her mother was coming up to town, and he should have the family at his ears. But taking them as a single body, he could manage them, and that was a detail. The Ashburys had remained at Bosco till that establishment was favoured with the tidings that so nearly concerned it. They were communicated to Maud's mother by the housekeeper, and then the beautiful sufferer had found in her defeat strength to seek another asylum. The two ladies had departed for a destination unknown. He didn't think they had turned up in London. Guy Firminger averred that there were precious portable objects which he was sure he should miss on returning to his country home. He came every day to Chester Street, and was evidently much less bored than Mary had prefigured by this regular tribute to verisimilitude. It was amusement enough to see the progress of their comedy, and to invent new touches for some of its scenes. The girl herself was amused. It was an opportunity like another for cleverness such as hers, and had much in common with private theatricals, especially with the rehearsals, the most amusing part. Moreover, she was good-natured enough to be really pleased at the service it was impossible for her not to acknowledge that she had rendered. Each of the parties to this queer contract had anecdotes and suggestions for the other, and each reminded the other duly that they must at every step keep their story straight. Except for the exercise of this care, Mary Gosselin found her duties less onerous than she had feared, and her part in general much more passive than active. It consisted, indeed, largely of murmuring thanks, and smiling, and looking happy and handsome, as well as perhaps also in saying, in answer to many questions, that nothing as yet was fixed, and of trying to remain humble when people expressed without ceremony that such a match was a wonder for such a girl. Her mother, on the other hand, was devotedly active. She treated the situation with private humour, but with public zeal, and, making it both real and ideal, told so many fibs about it that there were none left for Mary. The girl had failed to understand Mrs. Gosselin's interest in this elaborate pleasantry. The good lady had seen in it from the first more than she herself had been able to see. Mary performed her task mechanically, sceptically, but Mrs. Gosselin attacked hers with conviction, and had really the air at moments of thinking that their fable had crystallized into fact. Mary allowed her as little of this attitude as possible, and was ironical about her duplicity, warnings which the elder lady received with gaiety, until one day when repetition had made them act on her nerves. Then she begged her daughter with sudden asperity not to talk to her as if she were a fool. She had already had words with Hugh about some aspects of the affair. So much as this was evident in Chester Street, a smothered discussion which at the moment had determined the poor boy to go to Paris with Bolton Brown. The young men came back together after Mary had been engaged 3 weeks, but she remained in ignorance of what passed between Hugh and his mother the night of his return. She had gone to the opera with Lady Whiteroy, after one of her invariable comments on Mrs. Gosselin's invariable remark that of course Guy Firminger would spend his evening in their box. The remedy for his trouble, Lord Beaupre's prospective bride had said, was surely worse than the disease. She was in perfect good faith when she wondered that his lordship's sacrifices, his laborious cultivation of appearances, should pay. Hugh Gosselin dined with his mother, and at dinner talked of Paris and of what he had seen and done there. He kept the conversation superficial, and after he had heard how his sister at the moment was occupied, asked no question that might have seemed to denote an interest in the success of the experiment for which, in going abroad, he had declined responsibility. His mother could not help observing that he had never mentioned Guy Firminger by either of his names, and it struck her as a part of the same detachment that later, upstairs (she sat with him while he smoked), he should suddenly say, as he finished a cigar, "I return to New York next week." "Before your time? What for?" Mrs. Gosselin was horrified. "Oh, mamma, you know what for." "Because you still resent poor Mary's good nature?" "I don't understand it, and I don't like things I don't understand. Therefore I'd rather not be here to see it. Besides, I really can't tell a pack of lies." Mrs. Gosselin exclaimed and protested. She had arguments to prove that there was no call at present for the least deflection from the truth. All that any one had to reply to any question, and there could be none that was embarrassing save the ostensible determination of the date of the marriage, was that nothing was settled as yet; a form of words in which for the life of her she couldn't see any perjury. Why then go in for anything in such bad taste, to culminate only in something so absurd? Hugh demanded. If the essential part of the matter can't be spoken of as fixed, nothing is fixed; the deception becomes transparent, and they give the whole idea away. It's child's play. "That's why it's so innocent. All I can tell you is that practically their attitude answers. He's delighted with his success. Those dreadful women have given him up. They've already found some other victim." "And how is it all to end, please?" Mrs. Gosselin was silent a moment. "Perhaps it won't end." "Do you mean that the engagement will become real?" Again the good lady said nothing, until she broke out, "My dear boy, can't you trust your poor old mummy?" "Is that your speculation? Is that Mary's? I never heard of anything so odious!" Hugh Gosselin cried. But she defended his sister with eagerness, with a gloss of coaxing, maternal indignation, declaring that Mary's disinterestedness was complete. She had the perfect proof of it. Hugh was conscious, as he lighted another cigar, that the conversation was more fundamental than any that he had ever had with his mother, who, however, hung fire but for an instant when he asked her what this perfect proof might be. He didn't doubt of his sister, he admitted that, but the perfect proof would make the whole thing more luminous. It finally took the form of a confession from Mrs. Gosselin that the girl evidently liked, well, greatly liked, Mr. Bolton Brown. Yes, the good lady had seen for herself at Bosco that the smooth young American was making up to her, and that, time and opportunity aiding, something might very well happen which could not be regarded as satisfactory. She had been very frank with Mary, had besought her not to commit herself to a suitor who in the very nature of the case couldn't beat the most legitimate of their views. Mary, who pretended not to know what their views were, had denied that she was in danger, but Mrs. Gosselin had assured her that she had all the air of it, and had said triumphantly, "Agree to what Lord Beaupre asks of you, and I'll believe you." Mary had wished to be believed, so she had agreed. That was all the witchcraft any one had used. Mrs. Gosselin out-talked her son, but there were 2 or 3 plain questions that he came back to, and the first of these bore upon the ground of her aversion to poor Bolton Brown. He told her again, as he had told her before, that his friend was that rare bird, a maker of money who was also a man of culture. He was a gentleman to his finger-tips, accomplished, capable, kind, with a charming mother and 2 lovely sisters. She should see them. The sort of fellow, in short, whom it was stupid not to appreciate. "I believe it all, and if I had 3 daughters, he should be very welcome to one of them." "You might easily have had 3 daughters who wouldn't attract him at all. You've had the good fortune to have one who does, and I think you do wrong to interfere with it." "My eggs are in one basket, then, and that's a reason the more for preferring Lord Beaupre," said Mrs. Gosselin. "Then it is your calculation?" stammered Hugh in dismay; on which she coloured and requested that he would be a little less rough with his mother. She would rather part with him immediately, sad as that would be, than that he should attempt to undo what she had done. When Hugh replied that it was not to Mary but to Beaupre himself that he judged it important that he should speak, she informed him that a rash remonstrance might do his sister a cruel wrong. Dear Guy was most attentive. "If you mean that he really cares for her, there's the less excuse for his taking such a liberty with her. He's either in love with her or he isn't. If he is, let him make her a serious offer. If he isn't, let him leave her alone." Mrs. Gosselin looked at her son with a kind of patient joy. "He's in love with her, but he doesn't know it." "He ought to know it, and if he's so idiotic, I don't see that we ought to consider him." "Don't worry, he shall know it," Mrs. Gosselin cried. And, continuing to struggle with Hugh, she insisted on the delicacy of the situation. She made a certain impression on him, though on confused grounds. She spoke at one moment as if he was to forbear because the matter was a make-believe that happened to contain a convenience for a distressed friend, and at another as if one ought to strain a point because there were great possibilities at stake. She was most lucid when she pictured the social position and other advantages of a peer of the realm. What had those of an American stockbroker, however amiable and with whatever shrill belongings in the background, to compare with them? She was inconsistent, but she was diplomatic, and the result of the discussion was that Hugh Gosselin became conscious of a dread of injuring his sister. He became conscious at the same time of a still greater apprehension, that of seeing her arrive at the agreeable in a tortuous, a second-rate manner. He might keep the peace to please his mother, but he couldn't enjoy it, and he actually took his departure, travelling in company with Bolton Brown, who, of course, before going, waited on the ladies in Chester Street to thank them for the kindness they had shown him. It couldn't be kept from Guy Firminger that Hugh was not happy, though when they met, which was only once or twice before he quitted London, Mary Gosselin's brother flattered himself that he was too proud to show it. He had always liked old loafing Guy, and it was disagreeable to him not to like him now; but he was aware that he must either quarrel with him definitely or not at all, and that he had passed his word to his mother. Therefore his attitude was strictly negative. He took with the parties to it no notice whatever of the engagement, and he couldn't help it if to other people he had the air of not being initiated. They doubtless thought him strangely fastidious. Perhaps he was. The tone of London struck him in some respects as very horrid. He had grown in a manner away from it. Mary was impenetrable, tender, gay, charming, but with no patience, as she said, for his premature flight. Except when Lord Beaupre was present, you would not have dreamed that he existed for her. In his company, he had to be present more or less, of course, she was simply like any other English girl who disliked effusiveness. They each had the same manner, that of persons of rather a shy tradition, who were on their guard against public spooning. They practised their fraud with good taste, a good taste mystifying to Bolton Brown, who thought their precautions excessive. When he took leave of Mary Gosselin, her eyes consented for a moment to look deep down into his. He had been from the first of the opinion that they were beautiful, and he was more mystified than ever. If Guy Firminger had failed to ask Hugh Gosselin whether he had a fault to find with what they were doing, this was, in spite of old friendship, simply because he was too happy now to care much whom he didn't please, to care at any rate for criticism. He had ceased to be critical himself, and his high prosperity could take his blamelessness for granted. His happiness would have been offensive if people generally hadn't liked him, for it consisted in a kind of monstrous candid comfort. To take all sorts of things for granted was still his great, his delightful characteristic, but it didn't prevent his showing imagination and tact and taste in particular circumstances. He made, in their little comedy, all the right jokes and none of the wrong ones. The girl had an acute sense that there were some jokes that would have been detestable. She gathered that it was universally supposed she was having an unprecedented season, and something of the glory of an enviable future seemed indeed to hang about her. People no doubt thought it odd that she didn't go about more with her future husband, but those who knew anything about her knew that she had never done exactly as other girls did. She had her own ways, her own freedoms, and her own scruples. Certainly he made the London weeks much richer than they had ever been for a subordinate young person. He put more things into them, so that they grew dense and complicated. This frightened her at moments, especially when she thought with compunction that she was deceiving her very friends. She didn't mind taking the vulgar world in, but there were people she hated not to enlighten, to reassure. She could undeceive no one now, and indeed she would have been ashamed. There were hours when she wanted to stop. She had such a dread of doing too much. Hours when she thought with dismay that the fiction of the rupture was still to come, with its horrid train of new, untrue things. She spoke of it repeatedly to her confederate, who only postponed and postponed, told her she would never dream of forsaking him if she measured the good she was doing him. She did measure it, however, when she met him in the great world. She was of course always meeting him. That was the only way appearances were kept up. There was a certain attitude she could allow him to take on these occasions. It covered and carried off their subterfuge. He could talk to her unmolested. For herself she never spoke of anything but the charming girls, everywhere present, among whom he could freely choose. He didn't protest, because to choose freely was what he wanted, and they discussed these young ladies one by one. Some she recommended, some she disparaged, but it was almost the only subject she tolerated. It was her system, in short, and she wondered he didn't get tired of it. She was so tired of it herself. She tried other things that she thought he might find wearisome, but his good humour was magnificent. He was now really for the first time enjoying his promotion, his wealth, his insight into the terms on which the world offered itself to the happy few, and these terms made a mixture healing to irritation. Once at some glittering ball he asked her if she should be jealous if he were to dance again with Lady Whiteroy, with whom he had danced already, and this was the only occasion on which he had come near making a joke of the wrong sort. She showed him what she thought of it, and made him feel that the way to be forgiven was to spend the rest of the evening with that lovely creature. Now that the phalanx of the pressingly nubile was held in check, there was accordingly nothing to prevent his passing his time pleasantly. Before he had taken this effective way, the diplomatic mother, when she spied him flirting with a married woman, felt that in urging a virgin daughter's superior claims she worked for righteousness as well as for the poor girl. But Mary Gosselin protected these scandals practically by the still greater scandal of her indifference, so that he was in the odd position of having waited to be confined to know what it was to be at large. He had, in other words, the maximum of security with the minimum of privation. The lovely creatures of Lady Whiteroy's order thought Mary Gosselin charming, but they were the first to see through her falsity. All this carried our precious pair to the middle of July, but nearly a month before that, one night, under the summer stars, on the deck of the steamer that was to reach New York on the morrow, something had passed between Hugh Gosselin and his brooding American friend. The night was warm and splendid. These were their last hours at sea, and Hugh, who had been playing whist in the cabin, came up very late to take an observation before turning in. It was in this way that he chanced on his companion, who was leaning over the stern of the ship and gazing off, beyond its phosphorescent track, at the muffled, moaning ocean, the backward darkness, everything he had relinquished. Hugh stood by him for a moment, and then asked him what he was thinking about. Bolton Brown gave at first no answer, after which he turned round, and with his back against the guard of the deck, looked up at the multiplied stars. "He has it badly," Hugh Gosselin mentally commented. At last his friend replied, "About something you said yesterday." "I forget what I said yesterday." "You spoke of your sister's intended marriage. It was the only time you had spoken of it. You seemed to intimate that it might not, after all, take place." Hugh hesitated a little. "Well, it won't take place. They're not engaged, not really. This is a secret, a preposterous secret. I wouldn't tell any one else, but I'm willing to tell you. It may make a difference to you." Bolton Brown turned his head. He looked at Hugh a minute through the fresh darkness. "It does make a difference to me. But I don't understand," he added. "Neither do I. I don't like it. It's a pretense, a temporary make-believe, to help Beaupre through." "Through what?" "He's so run after." The young American stared, ejaculated, mused. "Oh, yes, your mother told me." "It's a sort of invention of my mother's, and a notion of his own, very absurd, I think, till he can see his way. Mary serves as a kind of escort for these first exposed months. It's ridiculous, but I don't know that it hurts her." "Oh," said Bolton Brown. "I don't know either that it does her any good." "No," said Bolton Brown. Then he added, "It's certainly very kind of her." "It's a case of old friends," Hugh explained, inadequately as he felt. "He has always been in and out of our house." "But how will it end?" "I haven't the least idea." Bolton Brown was silent. He faced about to the stern again and stared at the rush of the ship. Then shifting his position once more, "Won't the engagement, before they've done, develop into the regular thing?" Hugh felt as if his mother were listening. "I dare say not. If there were even a remote chance of that, Mary wouldn't have consented." "But mayn't he easily find that, charming as she is, he's in love with her?" "He's too much taken up with himself." "That's just a reason," said Bolton Brown. "Love is selfish." He considered a moment longer, and then went on, "And mayn't she find—" "Find what?" said Hugh, as he hesitated. "Why, that she likes him." "She likes him, of course, else she wouldn't have come to his assistance. But her certainty about herself must have been just what made her not object to lending herself to the arrangement. She could do it decently because she doesn't seriously care for him. If she did—" Hugh suddenly stopped. "If she did?" his friend repeated. "It would have been odious." "I see," said Bolton Brown gently. "But how will they break off?" "It will be Mary who'll break off." "Perhaps she'll find it difficult." "She'll require a pretext." "I see," mused Bolton Brown, shifting his position again. "She'll find one," Hugh declared. "I hope so," his companion responded. For some minutes neither of them spoke. Then Hugh asked, "Are you in love with her?" "Oh, my dear fellow!" Bolton Brown wailed. He instantly added, "Will it be any use for me to go back?" Again Hugh felt as if his mother were listening, but he answered, "Do go back." "It's awfully strange," said Bolton Brown. "I'll go back." "You had better wait a couple of months, you know." "Mayn't I lose her then?" "No, they'll drop it all." "I'll go back," the American repeated, as if he hadn't heard. He was restless, agitated. He had evidently been much affected. He fidgeted away dimly, moved up the level length of the deck. Hugh Gosselin lingered longer at the stern. He fell into the attitude in which he had found the other, leaning over it and looking back at the great vague distance they had come. He thought of his mother. End of Chapter 5. Chapter 6 of Lord Beaupre by Henry James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. To remind her fond parent of the vanity of certain expectations which she more than suspected her of entertaining, Mary Gosselin, while she felt herself intensely watched—it had all brought about a horrid new situation at home— produced every day some fresh illustration of the fact that people were no longer imposed upon. Moreover, these illustrations were not invented. The girl believed in them, and when once she had begun to note them, she saw them multiply fast. Lady Whiteroy, for one, was distinctly suspicious. She had taken the liberty more than once of asking the future Lady Beaupre what in the world was the matter with her. Brilliant figure as she was, and occupied with her own pleasures, which were of a very independent nature, she had nevertheless constituted herself Miss Gosseline's social sponsor. She took a particular interest in her marriage, an interest all the greater as it rested not only on a freely professed regard for her, but on a keen sympathy with the other party to the transaction. Lady Whiteroy, who was very pretty and very clever, and whom Mary secretly but profoundly mistrusted, delighted in them both, in short, so much so that Mary judged herself to be happy to be in a false position, so certain should she have been to be jealous had she been in a true one. This charming woman threw out inquiries that made the girl not care to meet her eyes, and Mary ended by forming a theory of the sort of marriage for Lord Beaupre that Lady Whiteroy really would have appreciated. It would have been a marriage to a fool, a marriage to Maud Ashbury or to Charlotte Firminger. She would have her reasons for preferring that, and, as regarded the actual prospect, she had only discovered that Mary was even more astute than herself. It will be understood how much our young lady was on the crest of the wave when I mentioned that in spite of this complicated consciousness she was one of the ornaments (Guy Firminger was of course another) of the party entertained by her zealous friend and Lord Whiteroy during the Goodwood week. She came back to town with the firm intention of putting an end to a comedy which had more than ever become odious to her, in consequence of which she had on this subject with her fellow comedian a scene, the scene she had dreaded, half pathetic, half ridiculous. He appealed to her, wrestled with her, took his usual ground that she was saving his life without really lifting a finger. He denied that the public was not satisfied with their pretext for postponement, their explanations of delay. What else was expected of a man who would wish to celebrate his nuptials on a suitable scale, but who had the misfortune to have had, one after another, 3 grievous bereavements? He promised not to molest her for the next 3 months, and to go away till his mourning was over, to go abroad, to let her do as she liked. He wouldn't come near her, he wouldn't even write, no one would know it, if she would let him keep up the mere form of their fiction, and he would let her off the very first instant he definitely perceived that this expedient had ceased to be effective. She couldn't judge of that, she must let him judge, and it was a matter in which she could surely trust to his honour. Mary Gosselin trusted to it, but she insisted on his going away. When he took such a tone as that, she couldn't help being moved. He breathed with such frank, generous lips on the irritation she had stored up against him. Guy Firminger went to Hamburg, and if his confederate consented not to clip the slender thread by which this particular engagement still hung, she made very short work with every other. A dozen invitations for Cowes, for the country, for Scotland, shimmered there before her, made a pathway of flowers, but she sent barbarous excuses. When her mother, aghast, said to her, "What then will you do?" she replied in a very conclusive manner, "I'll go home." Mrs. Gosselin was wise enough not to struggle. She saw that the thread was delicate, that it must dangle in quiet air. She, therefore, travelled back with her daughter to homely Hampshire, feeling that they were people of less importance than they had been for many a week. On the August afternoons they sat again on the little lawn on which Guy Firminger had found them the day he first became eloquent about the perils of the desirable young bachelor; and it was on this very spot that, toward the end of the month, and with some surprise, they beheld Mr. Bolton Brown once more approach. He had come back from America. He had arrived but a few days before. He was staying, of all places in the world, at the inn in the village. His explanation of this caprice was of all explanations the oddest. He had come 3,000 miles for the love of water-colour. There was nothing more sketchable than the sketchability of Hampshire. Wasn't it celebrated, classic? And he was so good as to include Mrs. Gosling's charming premises, and even their charming occupants, in his view of the field. He fell to work with speed, with a sort of feverish eagerness. He seemed possessed indeed by the frenzy of the brush. He sketched everything on the place, and when he had represented an object once, he went straight at it again. His advent was soothing to Mary Gosselin, in spite of his nervous activity. It must be admitted, indeed, that at the moment he arrived she had already felt herself in quieter waters. The August afternoons, the relinquishment of London, the simplified life, had rendered her a service which, if she had freely qualified it, she would have described as a restoration of her self-respect. If poor Guy found any profit in such conditions as these, there was no great reason to repudiate him. She had so completely shaken off responsibility that she took scarcely more than a languid interest in the fact, communicated to her by Lady Whiteroy, that Charlotte Firminger had also, as the newspapers said, proceeded to Hamburg. Lady Whiteroy knew, for Lady Whiteroy had proceeded as well. Her physician had discovered in her constitution a pressing need for the comfort imbibed in dripping matutinal tumblers. She chronicled Charlotte's presence, and even to some extent her behaviour, among the haunters of the spring, but it was not till some time afterwards that Mary learned how Miss Firminger's pilgrimage had been made under her ladyship's protection. This was a further sign that, like Mrs. Gosselin, Lady Whiteroy had ceased to struggle. She had, in town, only shrugged her shoulders ambiguously on being informed that Lord Beaupre's intended was going down to her stupid home. The fulness of Mrs. Gosselin's renunciation was apparent during the stay of the young American in the neighbourhood of that retreat. She occupied herself with her knitting, her garden, and the cares of a punctilious hospitality, but she had no appearance of any other occupation. When people came to tea, Bolton Brown was always there, and she had the self-control to attempt to say nothing that could assuage their natural surprise. Mrs. Ashbury came one day with poor Maud, and the two elder ladies, as they had done more than once before, looked for some moments into each other's eyes. This time it was not a look of defiance. It was rather, or it would have been for an observer completely in the secret, a look of reciprocity, of fraternity, a look of arrangement. There was, however, no one completely in the secret save perhaps Mary, and Mary didn't heed. The arrangement at any rate was ineffectual. Mrs. Gosselin might mutely say over the young American's eager, talkative shoulders, "Yes, you may have him if you can get him." The most rudimentary experiments demonstrated that he was not to be got. Nothing passed on this subject between Mary and her mother, whom the girl none the less knew to be holding her breath and continuing to watch. She counted it more and more as one unpleasant result of her conspiracy with Guy Firminger that had almost poisoned a relation that had always been sweet. It was to show that she was independent of it that she did as she liked now, which was almost always as Bolton Brown liked. When, in the first days of September, it was in the warm, clear twilight, and they happened, amid the scent of fresh hay, to be leaning side by side on a stile, he gave her a view of the fundamental and esoteric, as distinguished from the convenient and superficial motive of his having come back to England. She, of course, made no allusion to a prior tie. On the other hand, she insisted on his going up to London by the first train the next day. He was to wait. That was distinctly understood, for his satisfaction. She desired, meanwhile, to write immediately to Guy Firminger, but as he had kept his promise of not complicating their contract with letters, she was uncertain as to his actual whereabouts. She was only sure that he would have left Hamburg. Lady Whiteroy had become silent, so there were no more sidelights, and she was on the point of telegraphing to London for an address when she received a telegram from Bosco. The proprietor of that seat had arrived there the day before, and he found he could make trains fit if she would on the morrow allow him to come over and see her for a day or two. He had returned sooner than their agreement allowed, but she answered "Come," and she showed his missive to her mother, who at the sight of it wept with strange passion. Mary said to her, "For heaven's sake, don't let him see you." She lost no time. She told him on the morrow, as soon as he entered the house, that she couldn't keep it up another hour. "All right, it's no use," he conceded. "They're at it again." "You see, you've gained nothing," she replied triumphantly. She had instantly recognized that he was different, how much had happened. "I've gained some of the happiest days of my life." "Oh, that was not what you tried for." "Indeed it was, and I got exactly what I wanted," said Guy Firminger. They were in the cool little drawing-room where the morning light was dim. Guy Firminger had a sunburnt appearance, as in England people returning from other countries are apt to have, and Mary thought he had never looked so well. It was odd, but it was noticeable, that he had grown much handsomer since he had become a personage. He paused a moment, smiling at her while her mysterious eyes rested on him, and then he added, "Nothing ever worked better. It's no use now. People see. But I've got a start. I wanted to turn round and look about, and I have turned round and looked about. There are things I've escaped. I'm afraid you'll never understand how deeply I'm indebted to you." "Oh, it's all right," said Mary Gosselin. There was another short silence, after which he went on. "I've come back sooner than I promised, but only to be strictly fair. I began to see that we couldn't hold out, and that it was my duty to let you off. From that moment I was bound to put an end to your situation. I might have done so by letter, but that seems scarcely decent. It's all I came back for, you know, and it's why I wired to you yesterday." Mary hesitated an instant. She reflected intensely. What had happened, what would happen, was that if she didn't take care the signal for the end of their little arrangement would not have appeared to come from herself. She particularly wished it not to come from any one else. She had even a horror of that, so that after an instant she hastened to say, "I was on the very point of wiring to you. I was only waiting for your address." "Wiring to me?" He seemed rather blank. "To tell you that our absurd affair really, this time, can't go on another day. To put a complete stop to it." "Oh," said Guy Firminger. "So it's all right." "You always hated it," Guy laughed, and his laugh sounded slightly foolish to the girl. "I found yesterday that I hated it more than ever." Lord Beaupre showed a quickened attention. "For what reason, yesterday?" "I would rather not tell you, please. Perhaps sometime you'll find it out." He continued to look at her brightly and fixedly with his confused cheerfulness. Then he said with a vague, courteous alacrity, "I see, I see." She had an impression that he didn't see, but it didn't matter. She was nervous, and quite preferred that he shouldn't. They both got up, and in a moment he exclaimed, "Well, I'm intensely sorry it's over. It has been so charming." "You've been very good about it. I mean very reasonable," Mary said, to say something. Then she felt in her nervousness that this was just what she ought not to have said. It sounded ironical and provoking, whereas she had meant it as pure good nature. "Of course you'll stay to luncheon," she continued. She was bound in common hospitality to speak of that, and he answered that it would give him the greatest pleasure. After this her apprehension increased, and it was confirmed in particular by the manner in which he suddenly asked, "By the way, what reason shall we give?" "What reason?" "For our rupture. Don't let us seem to have quarrelled." "We can't help that," said Mary. "Nothing else will account for our behaviour." "Well, I shan't say anything about you." "Do you mean you'll let people think it was yourself who were tired of it?" "I mean I shan't blame you." "You ought to behave as if you cared," said Mary. Guy Firminger laughed, but he looked worried, and he evidently was puzzled. "You must act as if you had jilted me." "You're not the sort of person, unfortunately, that people jilt." Lord Beaupre appeared to accept this statement as incontestable; not with elation, however, but with candid regret the slightly embarrassed recognition of a fundamental obstacle. "Well, it's no one's business at any rate, is it?" "No one's, and that's what I shall say if people question me. Besides," Mary added, "they'll see for themselves." "What will they see?" "I mean they'll understand. And now we had better join mamma." It was his evident inclination to linger in the room after he had said this that gave her complete alarm. Mrs. Gosselin was in another room, in which she sat in the morning, and Mary moved in that direction, pausing only in the hall for him to accompany her. She wished to get him into the presence of a third person. In the hall he joined her, and in doing so laid his hand gently on her arm. Then, looking into her eyes with all the pleasantness of his honesty, he said, "It will be very easy for me to appear to care. For I shall care. I shall care immensely," Lord Beaupre added, smiling. Anything, it struck her, was better than that he should say, "We'll keep on if you like. I should. Only this time it will be serious. Hold me to it, do. Don't let me go. Lead me on to the altar, really." Some such words as these, she believed, were rising to his lips, and she had an insurmountable horror of hearing them. It was as if, well enough meant on his part, they would do her a sort of dishonour, so that all her impulse was quickly to avert them. That was not the way she wanted to be asked in marriage. "Thank you very much," she said, "but it doesn't in the least matter. You will seem to have been jilted, so it's all right." "All right? You mean—" He hesitated. He had coloured a little. His eyes questioned her. "I'm engaged to be married, in earnest." "Oh," said Lord Beaupre. "You asked me just now if I had a special reason for having been on the point of telegraphing to you, and I said I had. That was my special reason." "I see," said Lord Beaupre. He looked grave for a few seconds. Then he gave an awkward smile. But he behaved with perfect tact and discretion, didn't even ask her who the gentleman in the case might be. He congratulated her in the dark, as it were, and if the effect of this was indeed a little odd, she liked him for his quick perception of the fine fitness of pulling up short. Besides, he extracted the name of the gentleman soon enough from her mother, in whose company they now immediately found themselves. Mary left Guy Firminger with the good lady for half an hour before luncheon, and when the girl came back it was to observe that she had been crying again. It was dreadful, what she might have been saying. Their guest, however, at luncheon was not lachrymose. He was natural, but he was talkative and gay. Mary liked the way he now behaved, and more particularly the way he departed immediately after the meal. As soon as he was gone, Mrs. Gosselin broke out suppliantly, "Mary!" But her daughter replied, "I know, mamma, perfectly what you're going to say, and if you attempt to say it I shall leave the room." With this threat, day after day for the following time, she kept the terrible appeal unuttered until it was too late for an appeal to be of use. That afternoon she wrote to Bolton Brown that she accepted his offer of marriage. Guy Firminger departed altogether. He went abroad again and to far countries. He was therefore not able to be present at the nuptials of Miss Gosselin and the young American whom he had entertained at Bosco, which took place in the middle of November. Had he been in England, however, he probably would have felt impelled, by a due regard for past verisimilitude, to abstain from giving his countenance to such an occasion. His absence from the country contributed to the needed, even if astonishing, effect of his having been jilted. So likewise did the reputed vastness of Bolton Brown's young income, which in London was grossly exaggerated. Hugh Gosselin had perhaps a little to do with this. As he had sacrificed a part of his summer holiday, he got another month and came out to his sister's wedding. He took public comfort in his brother-in-law. Nevertheless, he listened with attention to a curious communication made him by his mother after the young couple had started for Italy, even to the point of bringing out the inquiry, in answer to her assertion that poor Guy had been ready to place everything he had at Mary's feet. Then why the devil didn't he do it? From simple delicacy he didn't want to make her feel as if she had lent herself to an artifice only on purpose to get hold of him, to treat her as if she too had been at bottom one of the very harpies she helped him to elude. Hugh thought a moment. That was delicate. "He's the dearest creature in the world. He's on his guard, he's prudent, he tested himself by separation. Then he came back to England in love with her. She might have had it all." "I'm glad she didn't get it that way." "She had only to wait, to put an end to their artifice, harmless as it was for the present, but still wait. She might have broken off in a way that would have made it come on again better." "That's exactly what she didn't want." "I mean as a quite separate incident," said Mrs. Gosselin. "I loathed their artifice, harmless as it was," her son observed. Mrs. Gosselin for a moment made no answer, then she turned away from the fire into which she had been pensively gazing, with the ejaculation, "Poor dear Guy!" "I can't for the life of me see that he's to be pitied." "He'll marry Charlotte Firminger." "If he's such an ass as that, it's his own affair." "Bessie Whiteroy will bring it about." "What has she to do with him?" "She wants to get hold of him." "Then why will she marry him to another woman?" "Because in that way she can select the other, a woman he won't care for. It will keep him from taking some one that's nicer." Hugh Gosselin stared. He laughed aloud. "Lord, mamma, you're deep." "Indeed I am. I see much more." "What do you see?" "Mary won't in the least care for America. Don't tell me she will," Mrs. Gosselin added, "for you know perfectly you don't believe it." "She'll care for her husband, she'll care for everything that concerns him." "He's very nice in his little way, he's delightful. But as an alternative to Lord Beaupre, he's ridiculous." "Mary's in a position in which she has nothing to do with alternatives." "For the present, yes, but not for ever. She'll have enough of your New York. They'll come back here. I see the future dark," Mrs. Gosselin pursued, inexorably musing. "Tell me then all you see." "She'll find poor Guy wretchedly married, and she'll be very sorry for him." "Do you mean that he'll make love to her? You give a queer account of your paragon." "He'll value her sympathy. I see life as it is." "You give a queer account of your daughter." "I don't give any account. She'll behave perfectly," Mrs. Gosselin somewhat inconsequently subjoined. "Then what are you afraid of?" "She'll be sorry for him, and it will be all a worry." "A worry to whom?" The good lady was silent a moment. "To me," she replied. "And to you as well." "Then they mustn't come back." "That will be a greater worry still." "Surely not a greater, a smaller. We'll put up with the lesser evil." "Nothing will prevent her coming to a sense eventually of what might have been. And when they both recognize it—" "It will be very dreadful," Hugh exclaimed, completing gaily his mother's phrase. "I don't see, however," he added, "what in all this you do with Bessie Whiteroy." "Oh, he'll be tired of her. She's hard. She'll have become despotic. I see life as it is," the good lady repeated. "Then all I can say is that it's not very nice. But they shan't come back. I'll attend to that," said Hugh Gosselin, who has attended to it up to this time successfully, though the rest of his mother's prophecy is so far accomplished—it was her second hit—as that Charlotte Firminger is now, strange as it may seem, Lady Beaupre. End of Chapter 6. End of Lord Beaupre by Henry James.